The cabin of Mesa Airlines Flight 227 was calm, almost serene, as passengers filed in, each one lost in their own world. But that peace was about to be shattered. "Get out of that seat now. You're making the other passengers uncomfortable." The voice cut through the hum of the airport, sharp and commanding. It was unmistakable. The lead flight attendant, Catherine Ward, stood at the front of first class, her uniform crisp and immaculate. She was the picture of professionalism, perfect posture, flawless makeup, and a tone that left no room for negotiation. But it wasn't the uniforms, the words, or even the way Catherine spoke that would define the moment. It was the target of her words. Sitting there in seat 2A was a young black boy, no more than 11 years old. He sat tall, hands neatly folded in his lap, looking out the window as the plane slowly filled with passengers. His clothes were immaculate, buttoned down, shirt, navy sweater, dark gray slacks, and polished black shoes. A backpack, monogrammed and made of soft leather, sat tucked neatly beneath his seat. He wasn't loud. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't even moving. Yet, Catherine's eyes locked on him with a focus that suggested he didn't belong. "Get out of that seat," she repeated, her voice more commanding this time. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't speak out of turn. He simply looked at her with calm eyes and replied, "This seat is mine. I'm not asking, I'm stating a fact." His words hung in the air, defiant but measured. There was no anger in his tone, no sign of fear, just calm clarity. The flight attendant blinked, taken aback by his response, but she quickly regained her composure. "Sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "this is first class. You must be confused." Her smile was tight, not a hint of warmth in it. She stood there, blocking the aisle, hands on her hips. Her authority clear, "I'm right, and you just don't know it yet." But the boy didn't move. As Catherine stood at the front of the aisle, her gaze still locked on Malik, the weight of her authority seemed to fill the cabin. For a moment, the bustling of passengers and the quiet hum of the aircraft faded into the background. Everything hinged on the confrontation about to unfold. She waited, arms crossed, but the young boy didn't budge. The passengers around them seemed oblivious, too wrapped up in their own preparations for takeoff. But not everyone. A middle-aged Latina woman, seated into C, noticed the interaction. Her eyes narrowed in confusion, and she leaned slightly toward the aisle, speaking in a hushed tone, trying to make sense of it. "Why are you removing him?" Mrs. Perez's voice was soft, but carried an undercurrent of disbelief. "He's not doing anything wrong." Catherine didn't even glance at Mrs. Perez, keeping her eyes firmly fixed on Malik, as if the question was beneath her. "This is policy, ma'am," she replied, her voice now cold, almost dismissive. But even as the words left her mouth, her voice cracked, betraying a brief flash of uncertainty. The woman's words lingered in the air, but Catherine pushed them aside. Malik remained perfectly still, his hands still folded in his lap, posture unbroken. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, as if he were waiting for something. Not for the argument to end, but for something else entirely. "Catherine, I've already told you," came a voice from the cockpit. It was Jason Miller, the first officer, who had been walking up the aisle, preparing for the flight. He stopped abruptly, sensing the rising tension, and glanced over at the confrontation. "What's going on here?" Jason asked, his tone seemingly neutral, though his eyes betrayed an underlying irritation. He glanced from Malik to Catherine, his brow furrowing slightly. Catherine quickly gave him a terse explanation, presenting the issue as a simple misunderstanding. "The child is seated in the wrong section," she said, keeping her voice firm, though her eyes flickered in Malik's direction, where his boarding pass was still prominently displayed. "I'm just following the standard policy for unaccompanied minors." Malik's.com response had shaken her for a moment. It wasn't just that he was calm, it was the unwavering confidence in his voice. It was as though he knew something she didn't, and that unnerved her. She glanced down at the boarding pass in his hand. It was clearly marked, Mesa Airlines, Flight 227, Seat 2A, exactly where he was sitting, but she wasn't ready to back down. "I'm sorry, sweetie," she said, her voice turning syrupy, though her eyes remained cold. "But that's just how things work. You'll need to come with me to the back." Malik didn't blink. His hands remained steady as he held out the boarding pass, clear and unwavering. "Mesa Airlines, Flight 227, Seat 2A. My father confirmed everything with your VIP desk." His voice was calm, without a trace of hesitation. Catherine's expression tightened. She didn't take the boarding pass, didn't even glance at it again. Instead, she looked past him, over to a young ground staffer who had just stepped onto the jet bridge. Her name tag read Tamika Jones, and though she looked no older than 25, her presence was unflinching. She paused when she saw Malik, but her face stayed composed. Tamika stepped forward and quietly took Malik's boarding pass from his hand. She scanned it quickly, and the confirmation flashed on her device. Seat 2A, priority seat. "Confirmed. There's no issue here," Tamika said with a calm voice, looking over to Catherine. "He's in the correct seat. The clearance has been verified through VIP services." For the first time, Catherine hesitated. She glanced at Tamika, but the deflection came too quickly. "But unaccompanied minors, they don't sit in first class." Tamika didn't let her finish. "The clearance notice from executive operations. It's been approved. There's no need to move him," she said firmly, her calm demeanor putting Catherine on the back foot. But it wasn't just the flight attendant who was speaking now. Mrs. Perez, seated behind Malik, had had enough. She stood up from her seat, and this time, her voice carried louder, a note of defiance in it. "Why are you removing him?" she repeated, but this time, there was more weight in her words. "I saw the ticket. He belongs there. I don't care what policy you're quoting. He's not the problem." Her words landed with a ripple effect, echoing in the otherwise tense silence of the cabin. Catherine didn't respond. She simply stood there, arms crossed, eyes flicking nervously between the passengers around her. Malik didn't move. His face was the picture of calm, even as the weight of the moment pressed in on him. His eyes, steady, remained focused, straight ahead, as if he were speaking to no one but the seat before him. Suddenly, Jason Miller, the first officer, spoke again, his tone colder this time. "Let's just move him to coach," he said, not asking, but dictating, as though the decision had already been made. "We don't want any disruptions before takeoff." Tamika blinked, caught off guard. "Sir," she said, her voice soft but firm, "he's cleared for first class. His record shows a special clearance. It's been approved by VIP operations." Jason raised a hand, his expression unreadable. "We'll deal with this later. For now, just get him up," he said, brushing aside the details with a nonchalant wave. Malik didn't argue. He didn't shout or demand attention. He simply stood up, slowly, with the quiet dignity he had carried all through this ordeal. He picked up his leather backpack and looked once more at the seat in front of him. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the back of the plane, escorted not by kindness, but by policy. Policy that was tainted by something far more insidious: prejudice. The row of first-class seats behind him was empty. The aisle was quiet. The passengers, now all eyes on him, watched as he was led away, not with curiosity, but with quiet discomfort. He didn't look at them, didn't pay attention to their whispered comments or their confused glances. He simply walked with purpose, head held high. He was shown to an empty seat next to the emergency exit, usually reserved for adults, where he sat down without a single complaint, his hands folded neatly in his lap once more. He didn't lean back against the window. He didn't slouch or complain. He simply sat, straight-backed and still, just as he had been taught to. Across the aisle, a man stared at him, the look in his eyes a mix of disbelief and confusion. A younger couple whispered quietly, but Malik didn't meet their eyes. He didn't need to. His gaze remained fixed on the seatbelt sign above him, as if it was the only thing that mattered. A few moments later, Malik pulled out his phone, his fingers tapping a number with practiced ease. The phone rang once, twice, then, his father's voice, steady and calm, answered on the other end. "Dad, it's happening again," Malik said, his voice soft but clear. The hum of the aircraft seemed distant, muffled by the weight of the moment. Malik sat alone in his seat near the emergency exit, the distant chatter of passengers around him fading into a blur. His hands remained steady, folded neatly in his lap, his back straight as always. It wasn't the discomfort of the seat, or the distance from first class that weighed on him. No, it was something deeper, something he had felt before. He stared at the seatbelt sign above, its soft red glow, a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong when people made judgments based on the color of someone's skin. A soft vibration interrupted his thoughts. His phone buzzed in his hand, and without hesitation, Malik unlocked it. The contact he was looking for, "Dad," popped up on the screen. His thumb hovered for a moment, unsure if he should send a message or make the call. But he already knew the answer. He had to speak to him. The call went through, ringing once, twice. Then came the calm, steady voice on the other end of the line. "Malik, what's going on?" Malik's voice remained composed, even though the silence around him seemed deafening. "Dad, it's happening again." His words were simple, but the weight of them carried far more than he could say. For a moment, there was only the faint sound of his father's breathing on the other end. Malik had said nothing new. This wasn't the first time he had found himself in this situation, nor would it likely be the last. But there was something different this time. He could feel it. His father's calm, collected tone reached him instantly, even through the miles separating them. "I'm on my way," David Johnson said, his voice even but firm. "Don't move. We'll fix this." The words were spoken without hesitation, without any sense of urgency or panic. David wasn't someone to raise his voice. He never had been. But when something was wrong, when his son was wronged, his presence alone was enough to change everything. Malik's chest tightened, but not out of fear. He hadn't cried, hadn't even raised his voice. He didn't need to. His father's quiet confidence had always been enough to ground him. It was like this. When something was wrong, Malik knew exactly what to do. Stay calm, stay still, and speak the truth. As the phone call ended, Malik placed the device back in his lap, looking up at the ceiling, watching the light flicker ever so slightly. The cabin felt heavier now, not because of the weight of the aircraft or the growing turbulence outside, but because of something much more subtle, the growing sense of injustice. It wasn't just the seat he'd been moved from. It wasn't just the policy that had been warped to fit someone else's personal biases. No, it was something deeper than that, something that Malik had experienced before, and something he knew far too well. The quiet, unspoken judgment that came when people didn't think he belonged. A moment earlier, he had looked out over the cabin, wondering what the other passengers were thinking. Were they confused? Did they feel the same discomfort he did? Or were they too busy with their own lives to notice what was happening to him? Malik had been on enough flights to know how these things went. His mother, Dr. Malik Johnson, had flown with him countless times, and he'd never encountered any issues when they traveled together. But the last time they had flown, a similar situation had happened. They'd been upgraded to first class, as a thank you for frequent flyer miles. But within minutes of sitting down, they were questioned, prodded, asked if they were sure they had the right seats. Even after showing their tickets, the flight attendants had hesitated, acted confused, as if it was impossible that someone like Malik could belong in first class. He remembered how his mother had felt that day, an uneasy tension in her voice, a slight crack in her usual calm. It wasn't a big deal, she had told him afterward. They had apologized and moved on. But Malik remembered the way she had looked at him when they got to their destination. There had been something in her eyes, a quiet understanding that, despite all the success, despite all the years of hard work, there was still something out of place in the world when it came to them, when it came to him. This time was different though. Malik wasn't with his mother. He was alone, but his father was coming, and that was all that mattered. His father, David Johnson, wasn't just a CEO. He wasn't just an executive whose name could open doors. He was Malik's father, and when Malik needed him most, David's calm but commanding presence would always be there. Malik's phone buzzed again, but this time, it was just a notification. His father's text was waiting for him. "Don't worry, son. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." He felt the tension in his chest loosen, but the feeling wasn't one of relief. It was the quiet resolve of knowing that, no matter what, his father was there. Malik didn't have to shout, didn't have to fight. He had done what his father had taught him. Stay calm, stay strong, and speak the truth. And now, his father was going to make sure everyone else understood it too. He sat there, back straight, hands folded, staring ahead as the passengers around him continued their boarding process. He noticed a few eyes darting toward him, but he didn't look back. He had already won. This wasn't about the seat or the flight. This was about something much larger. The door to the jet bridge slid open, and in walked a man in a dark suit, David Johnson. The world around Malik shifted as he saw his father, but he remained where he was, calm, composed. He didn't smile, but for the first time since the incident began, a wave of peace washed over him. Everything was going to be okay. He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to do anything. His father had arrived, and with him, the promise that this situation would be fixed. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thicker the moment David Johnson stepped onto the jet bridge. The usual hum of passengers getting settled, the low chatter of flight attendants preparing, and the sounds of overhead compartments being closed. All of it vanished, as if the world had paused for a moment. David wasn't just any passenger boarding Mesa Airlines Flight 227. He wasn't someone who needed to announce his arrival. His presence spoke volumes, and it was felt long before he made it to the front of the plane. He moved through the terminal with deliberate calm, his steps slow but steady, radiating an undeniable presence. There was nothing extravagant about his appearance, no flashy accessories, no ostentatious gestures. He wore a simple, tailored suit, the kind that didn't shout for attention, but demanded it through its quiet elegance. His executive badge was clipped neatly to his lapel, its significance clear to anyone who had ever worked in corporate circles. But David wasn't walking through the terminal as a CEO. No, today, he was a father, and his son's dignity had been violated in front of a plane full of strangers. His son had called him, and that was all the reason he needed. As he neared the gate, David's eyes locked onto the staff standing near the door. It was Tamika Jones who spotted him first. She'd scanned Malik's boarding pass earlier, confirming the seat assignment that had been unjustly questioned. The moment she saw David, a subtle but immediate shift occurred in the air. She moved quickly toward him, her posture stiffening, but she managed a small, controlled smile as she spoke. "Mr. Johnson," she greeted him softly, the unease in her tone betraying the calm she was trying to project. "Your son's boarding pass was valid. We scanned it earlier. He was in 2A. I don't know why they moved him." David nodded, acknowledging her. "You did your job," he said, his voice calm, but filled with purpose. There was no anger in his words, no hint of the fury that might have boiled inside of another parent in this situation. He appreciated Tamika's honesty. "Thank you." Without further delay, he walked past her and made his way toward the cabin, his gaze fixed ahead. To Mesa Airlines executives, trailing behind him like obedient followers, hurried to catch up, clearly trying to manage the situation without making it worse. They knew this wasn't just any complaint. They knew the man walking ahead of them could bring real consequences if this wasn't handled the right way. David didn't acknowledge the executives who followed him. He didn't need to. He knew where he was headed, and he knew what he had to do. The moment he entered the first-class cabin, the atmosphere inside seemed to shift. It was as though the weight of the injustice Malik had experienced suddenly became real to everyone else. The passengers in first class, who had been unaware of the unfolding drama, now seemed to feel it too. Some of them shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Their awareness suddenly heightened. Catherine, the flight attendant who had started this mess, was standing near the front galley. Her posture remained perfect, but there was no mistaking the way her expression faltered when she saw David. Her confidence evaporated in an instant, and for the first time, she looked unsure of herself. "Sir, you can't just..." Catherine began, her words faltering as David stepped into the cabin. He raised his hand slowly, cutting her off with a calm gesture that had no need for explanation. "I'm not here to discuss your policies," he said, his voice low, but carrying an undeniable weight. His eyes, sharp and steady, held hers for a moment, before he reached into his jacket pocket. Without looking away, he pulled out a laminated ID card and handed it to her, his movements deliberate. "David Johnson, Mesa Airlines partner, Executive Operations Access," he said, his tone as controlled as it had been since the moment he entered the terminal. Catherine's eyes widened as she took the card, but she didn't ask to verify it. She already knew. There was no mistaking David's presence now. "Please see the crew immediately," David added, his tone firm, though still devoid of anger. David didn't wait for her to respond. He turned to the other executives who had followed him, giving them a simple nod. "Get them now." The two executives exchanged glances and moved to do as they were told. But it was clear that David had already taken control of the situation. There was no more room for debate, no more room for excuses. This was no longer just about a first-class seat. This was about the dignity of his son, and it was about to be restored. As Catherine stood frozen near the front galley, Jason Miller, the first officer, stepped into the aisle. He had been watching this unfold with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. The sight of David Johnson standing calmly in front of him shifted something in Jason, though he wasn't sure what. The atmosphere had changed, and he knew that. "What's going on here?" Jason's voice was quiet, but carried an edge, as if he, too, felt the weight of what had just transpired. Catherine quickly relayed the situation again, her voice now softer, but the defensive tone was still there. "It's a misunderstanding. The child is in the wrong seat," she said, trying to salvage her authority in the situation, but she was losing ground fast. Jason looked at Malik, seated in the back of the plane, and then at David. He wasn't sure what had changed, but something had. He stepped forward, but this time, his approach wasn't as authoritative. He didn't make any demands. Instead, his voice was unsure. "Let's move him to coach. We don't want any disruptions before takeoff," Jason said, as though it was a simple, reasonable solution. But to David, it was anything but reasonable. David's expression remained unchanged, his calmness an unmovable force. "We're not moving him," he said firmly. "My son will stay where he belongs." There was no room for argument in David's voice, and the quiet intensity of his words was enough to stop Jason in his tracks. Malik, who had been sitting silently in the back of the plane, watching everything unfold, didn't move. But now, with his father's arrival, he could feel a sense of relief. His father had come, not with threats or anger, but with an unshakable presence that commanded respect. David turned to the airline executives who had been trailing behind him, his gaze steady and unwavering. "This ends now. This was never about policy. This was about perception, And your crew saw my son in first class and assumed he didn't belong. That's wrong. The silence that followed David's words was deafening. Even Jason, who had been prepared to argue, now stood still, unsure of how to respond. David's calm authority had turned the tables, and now the crew and passengers were all on notice. The power had shifted. The tension inside the cabin was palpable. Now, and David's calm demeanor only added to the weight of what was about to unfold. As he stood in the front galley, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The flight attendants, who had been so sure of their actions moments earlier, now appeared small, hesitant. Even the executives, who had followed David into the cabin, could sense that the situation had shifted beyond just a first-class seating issue. David stood still, his eyes calmly surveying the crew before him. There was no need to shout or raise his voice. His presence alone commanded attention. The flight attendants had tried to defend their actions, but now, with David in the room, the balance of power had irrevocably changed. Catherine, who had originally been so sure of herself, was now fumbling with her words. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard by the calmness of David's authority. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice faltering. We didn't know who you were. We followed the standard policy for unaccompanied minors. It was a misunderstanding." David's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about policy," he said quietly but firmly. "This is about your perception. The moment you saw my son in first class, you assumed he didn't belong, and that's where you went wrong." The weight of David's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The silence that followed was thick with realization. But Catherine seemed determined to justify herself, her voice rising slightly, as if to regain the authority she had lost. "I'm just doing my job," she said, the edge in her tone betraying her defensiveness. "It's protocol for unaccompanied minors to sit in a different area. It's not personal." David stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "You see? That's where the problem lies," he said, his voice measured, but carrying an undeniable weight. "You didn't even take a second to consider whether Malik actually belonged there. You didn't bother to check the records. You assumed his seat was wrong simply because of the color of his skin." The room seemed to go still, and the weight of David's words sunk in. He wasn't just challenging the actions of the flight crew. He was forcing them to confront something deeper. Something that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface of their interactions. The airline executives standing behind David shifted uncomfortably, not knowing how to respond to the truth that had just been laid bare. They had followed David into the cabin, hoping to defuse the situation, but now it was clear that there was no quick fix. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. This was about something much bigger, a systemic issue that had been perpetuated, quietly, almost unnoticed, for years. David didn't wait for them to respond. He turned to Jason Miller, the first officer, who had been standing silently by the cockpit door. Jason had been complicit in the decision to move Malik, but now, with David standing in front of him, he looked like a man who had just realized the depth of his mistake. "You," David said, his voice cool but unyielding. "You told the gate agent to move my son. You didn't question Catherine's judgment. You just assumed that a child, my child, didn't belong in first class, even though he had every right to be there." Jason opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He seemed to realize, too late, the gravity of his actions. He had gone along with the decision without questioning it, without considering the broader implications. David wasn't just accusing him of making a mistake. He was calling out his complacency, his willingness to accept a biased decision without challenge. "I followed the procedure," Jason finally said, but his voice was weak, as if he knew it was no longer a valid excuse. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean for this to happen." David's gaze hardened, but his voice remained calm. "It's not about intent, Jason. It's about impact. You didn't mean any harm, but you caused harm nonetheless. And that's the problem with blindly following rules without thinking. You allowed your personal biases to influence your decisions. That's what needs to change. The tension in the cabin was now almost suffocating. No one spoke. The other passengers, who had been watching quietly up until this point, were now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. The soft murmurs of discomfort had turned into a collective silence. It wasn't just about a child being removed from his seat. It was about a system that had failed him, and David was making sure everyone knew it. David didn't let the silence linger for long. He turned to the airline executives who had been standing behind him, watching the interaction unfold. They had tried to maintain control of the situation, but now it was clear they were just as complicit as the flight attendants. They had allowed this to happen, and they had let it escalate. It's not enough to apologize, David continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. It's not enough to say you'll do better next time. The truth is, you allowed bias to shape your decisions, and that's something that can't be fixed with a few apologies. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about a system that needs to change. His words hung in the air, leaving no room for argument. David wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't looking for an apology. What he wanted was action. He wanted real, lasting change. And he wasn't going to leave until it was clear that the airline understood the magnitude of the issue. At this point, there was no denying the shift in the room. The power dynamics had changed. The flight attendants, the first officer, and the executives who had been so confident in their actions moments ago were now the ones on the defensive. They weren't in control anymore. David was. He turned back to Malik, who was still sitting near the emergency exit. Despite the tension in the cabin, Malik remained calm, his posture unchanged. He hadn't moved since he was moved to the back of the plane. But David could see it in his eyes, the quiet strength, the resolve. Malik, David said, his voice softening just slightly as he spoke to his son. You've handled this with more grace than most adults could ever muster. I'm proud of you. Malik didn't respond with a smile or words of gratitude. He simply nodded, his eyes meeting his father's with a look that conveyed both pride and a quiet question. Are we fixing this? David gave a small nod, his gaze steady. We're fixing this, son. Together. The tension in the cabin had been thick enough to cut with a knife, but as David's voice echoed through the first-class cabin, it felt like the air shifted, charged with something heavier than just a conflict over a seat. It was a transformation, a reckoning that rippled through the room, changing not only the attitudes of the airline crew, but also the passengers who had quietly observed the injustice unfold. David's calm, unwavering authority had commanded attention, but it wasn't just his presence that made a difference. It was the truth he spoke, direct, clear, and undeniable. His words weren't just aimed at the crew. They were aimed at the entire system, at every assumption, every unspoken prejudice that had allowed this situation to occur. The message was simple. We will not tolerate this. The quiet murmurs that had once been confined to the corners of the cabin now grew louder, not out of chaos or disorder, but out of the recognition of something that everyone had just witnessed: injustice. Some passengers, who had initially remained silent, now began to stir in their seats. They looked around at each other, exchanging looks of disbelief and understanding, as if they too had just realized that what had happened to Malik wasn't just a mistake. It was something far deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Linda Perez, the middle-aged Latina woman who had spoken up earlier, stood from her seat once more. This time, she wasn't speaking in hushed tones, trying to make sense of it all. Now, her voice was clear, firm, and full of conviction. That boy had a ticket, she said, her voice growing louder with every word. I saw it. He was calm. He wasn't causing trouble. Why was he moved? This wasn't a mistake. This was something else. Her words hung in the air, piercing the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the cabin. Catherine, The lead flight attendant, still standing near the galley, looked away. But the guilt in her eyes was now unmistakable. She had no response, no justification. The truth was laid bare. David didn't address her directly. Instead, his focus shifted to the crew, to the executives who had followed him onto the plane. He wasn't angry. His demeanor hadn't changed. He was still calm, still composed, but now, there was a weight in his voice that carried authority and finality. "This isn't just about one seat," he said, his voice firm and steady. "This is about every seat, every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong simply because of who they are. I'm asking you, as a company, to look at this with new eyes." The airline executives stood in stunned silence. They hadn't expected this confrontation to go this deep. They had hoped to diffuse the situation quickly, but now, it was clear that this wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about confronting an entire culture of bias, one that had gone unchecked for too long. The passengers who had been watching the scene unfold were no longer passive observers. They were now part of the story. Malik's quiet dignity had sparked something in them, something that made them realize they couldn't just sit in silence anymore. Linda Perez had spoken up. Others were starting to feel the pull of the moment. It wasn't just about the injustice they had seen. It was about what they could do to change it. George Whitmore, the well-dressed older white man who had been seated in the front row, was the next to stand. He had been silent until now, observing the entire situation with quiet disbelief. But now, something had shifted within him. He stepped out into the aisle, his voice steady, his words deliberate. "You know, I've flown Mesa for over 20 years, George said, his voice calm but filled with the weight of experience. "I've had champagne in this exact seat on Christmas morning and enjoyed every moment of it. But I've also seen how quickly a person like that young man over there gets judged. Not by their actions, but by their presence." He paused, looking over at Malik, who still sat near the emergency exit. Malik had not moved since David had entered the cabin. His posture was still straight, hands folded, his gaze calm and composed. "I judged him," George continued, his voice a little softer. "Now, I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it. I saw a young black boy sitting alone in first class, and thought, maybe he's in the wrong place, and I was wrong." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. George's admission had shaken something loose in the passengers around him. They hadn't said anything earlier. They had watched, unsure whether to get involved, but now, there was no going back. The silence had been broken, and the truth had been spoken. It wasn't just the crew who had failed to do the right thing. The passengers, too, had stood by and done nothing. David nodded in George's direction. "Thank you for saying that," he said, his tone still steady, but filled with quiet appreciation. "We don't often acknowledge the biases we carry with us, but they shape how we see the world, and how we treat the people in it. That's why this moment is so important." The transformation in the cabin was undeniable now. It wasn't just about David's confrontation with the airline crew. It wasn't even just about Malik's dignity. It was about everyone in that cabin coming to terms with the biases they had allowed to go unchallenged for far too long. Tamika Jones, the young ground staffer who had scanned Malik's boarding pass earlier, stood near the galley. She had watched the entire exchange quietly, but now, her brow furrowed in concern. She could feel it too, the weight of what had just happened. She had been the one to confirm Malik's seat earlier, but even she hadn't understood the full gravity of the situation until now. David turned to her. "Tamika," he said, his voice calm but direct, "could you escort Malik back to his seat in first class?" Tamika nodded, a small smile breaking across her face. "Of course, Mr. Johnson," she said softly, as Malik stood and walked toward the front of the plane. The cabin remained still, quiet with anticipation. The passengers, who had watched in stunned silence moments earlier, now watched with respect. Some nodded, Others straightened in their seats. A few passengers even gave a small, subtle applause as Malik passed by. Malik didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply walked with the same quiet strength he had exhibited throughout the ordeal. Head held high, back straight, as though nothing had changed. He reached the front of the cabin, stopped, and turned to the seat he had been so unfairly removed from. There was no drama, no confrontation, just quiet, steadfast dignity. Malik returned to his seat in 2A, where he belonged, and sat down without a word. David stood at the front of the cabin, observing his son. There was a sense of quiet pride in his eyes. His son had handled this better than he ever could have imagined, and in that moment, David knew that the system was changing. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but this was a start. David turned to the crew. "We can't move forward," he said quietly, "if we're still stuck in where we think people belong." The cabin was still when David Johnson stepped back and surveyed the scene, his eyes briefly meeting Malik's. The young boy sat in 2A once again, his posture impeccable, his hands folded in his lap. There was no smile on Malik's face, no triumphant look. He was simply there, occupying the seat that was rightfully his. A silent reminder that dignity had been restored. But the calm, composed silence didn't last long as the flight crew began to move about. The quiet buzz of conversations started to fill the air. The murmurs of passengers, who had been watching in silence just moments ago, began to shift from confusion to understanding. The atmosphere in the cabin, which had once been filled with tension and discomfort, had transformed into something else, a subtle but powerful shift in perspective. David looked around the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the passengers who had witnessed the ordeal. Linda Perez, the woman who had first spoken up for Malik, caught his eye. She gave him a small, acknowledging nod, her expression a mixture of pride and quiet satisfaction. She had been the first to stand up and speak the truth, and now she felt the weight of the moment with every passing second. George Whitmore, the older gentleman who had admitted his own bias, glanced at Malik with a new understanding, a quiet recognition of the quiet strength the young boy had shown. David's attention shifted back to the crew. Catherine stood near the front galley, still frozen in place. The other flight attendants were moving, albeit uneasily, as though trying to pretend nothing had happened. But David could see the cracks in their facade. They knew what had been exposed. David wasn't done yet. He turned to the airline executives who had been following him, still standing in the background, their faces flushed with discomfort. They hadn't expected this to escalate the way it had. They hadn't thought that one father, one child, could make such a profound impact on the culture of a company like Mesa Airlines. But they had just witnessed it. David took a step forward, addressing the executives who stood in the aisle, trying their best to avoid eye contact with him. "This cannot be a momentary change," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "What just happened today isn't just an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a much larger problem that your airline, and many others, have ignored for far too long." One of the executives, a middle-aged man with glasses, cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson, we understand your concerns, and we take this seriously," he said, his tone apologetic, though tinged with defensiveness. "But we've already implemented procedures for handling unaccompanied minors. We've trained our staff to follow those protocols." David held up a hand, his eyes sharp. "Protocols aren't enough," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Policies don't mean anything if they're not being enforced in a way that is fair, just, and respectful. What just happened wasn't a failure of procedure. It was a failure of perception." The silence in the cabin grew thicker as the weight of David's words landed with full force. The executives shifted nervously, exchanging uncertain glances. But David wasn't finished. "I'm asking you, as a company, to look at this situation. Not just as a mistake," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I want you to recognize that bias, both conscious and unconscious, is what led to this moment. And if you truly want to make a difference, if you truly want to set a new standard, you need to address that bias head-on. You need to put systems in place that don't just look at the surface but also dig deeper into how your staff perceives and treats people. The executives were quiet now, no one daring to speak up. David paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. He wasn't speaking out of anger, but out of a deep conviction that what had happened to Malik was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that affected not just one airline, but society as a whole. The silence in the cabin was broken by the soft sound of Malik Johnson, who had been standing near the back of the plane, watching the entire conversation unfold. She stepped forward, her expression serious but resolute. "I think we need to take a closer look at how we address bias in the airline industry," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "We need to make sure this never happens again, not just with Malik, but with anyone. The Malik Protocol is a good place to start." David turned to her, his expression one of quiet approval. "Yes," he said simply, "the Malik Protocol." The name, though not yet formalized, carried an undeniable weight. It was a symbol of what had happened today, a symbol of how one boy, with the quiet support of his father, had shifted the conversation about dignity, respect, and fairness in the airline industry. At that moment, Catherine Ward, the lead flight attendant who had started this entire debacle, looked up from the floor. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but closed it again, her expression torn between guilt and defensiveness. She was caught in the silence of her own actions, the weight of the truth now, too much to ignore. David didn't address her directly. Instead, he turned to the rest of the crew, his voice calm but final. "Catherine, you've been with the company for years," he said, his tone almost regretful. "But your instincts today weren't just wrong, they were harmful. You made a judgment based on a biased perception, and that's not acceptable. You let that bias overrule the very procedures you claim to follow." David turned back to the executives, his gaze now unwavering. "I'm asking you to make the Malik Protocol official," he continued. "It's not just about policy. It's about changing the way we see people. It's about making sure no one else ever has to face what Malik faced today." As the conversation continued to unfold, the passengers in the cabin watched in silence. Some nodded in agreement, while others seemed lost in thought, processing the implications of what they had just witnessed. For them, this wasn't just a moment of public accountability. It was a moment of transformation. In the quiet of the first-class cabin, the reality of the situation set in. Malik had not been a victim of a mistake. He had been a victim of bias, a quiet prejudice that had gone unchecked for far too long. But his dignity had never been in question. It had only been tested, and in the end, it was restored as Malik sat in 2A, his hands still folded neatly in his lap. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone spoke volumes. He had reminded everyone in that cabin what dignity looked like when it was tested, and how powerful it was when it was carried with grace. The finality of the situation came not in the form of loud declarations or dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet realization that change had already begun. David's call for a new standard, for a protocol that would protect and empower passengers, was not just a plea, it was a demand for respect. David turned to Malik one last time, his voice soft but filled with pride. "You did well today, son. You taught us all what it means to stand tall in the face of injustice." Malik looked up at his father, his eyes calm but filled with understanding. He didn't need to speak. His silence said it all. The change they had started was just the beginning. As the aircraft's engines rumbled to life, and the plane began its slow taxi to the runway, the cabin had already taken flight in its own way. The Malik Protocol had been born, not just in a boardroom, but in the heart of the skies. And it was a standard that would guide the way passengers were treated, forever, changing the industry, one seat at a time.